When James Morgan limped through Denver International Airport that cold November morning, his faded military jacket and worn boots drawing no attention from the rushing crowds, nobody looked twice at the weathered man with the old cane. The flight attendants who would soon escort him from his first-class seat, their voices sharp and cold with judgment, had no idea they were humiliating the very man who signed their paychecks. The wealthy businessman who complained about sharing the cabin with someone beneath his station could not have known he was sneering at the owner of Skyward Airlines itself. And when James Morgan quietly gathered his small bag and limped to economy, dignity intact despite the burning shame, he made a decision that would change everything. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The automatic doors of Denver International Airport slid open at 5:30 in the morning, and James Morgan stepped into the fluorescent-lit terminal with the careful, measured gait of a man who had learned to navigate the world with pain as a constant companion. His cane, a simple aluminum affair with a rubber grip worn smooth by years of use, tapped against the polished floor in a steady rhythm that spoke of both necessity and practiced grace. He was 53 years old, though the lines etched around his blue eyes and the silver threading through his brown hair might have suggested older to a casual observer. His jacket, a faded olive-green military surplus piece with frayed cuffs and a small American flag patch on the shoulder, had seen better decades. Beneath it, he wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans that were clean but obviously worn, the kind of clothing that whispered of careful budgeting and priorities that did not include vanity. His boots, scuffed brown leather that had walked through deserts and mountains in another life, carried him forward with quiet determination. James carried only a small canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder, its weight causing him to shift slightly to compensate for the weakness in his left leg, the leg that had been shattered by shrapnel in Kandahar 12 years ago and had never quite healed right despite 3 surgeries and countless hours of physical therapy. He moved through the early morning crowds like a ghost, unremarkable and unseen. Just another traveler in a sea of thousands. No one noticed the way he paused at the departures board, his eyes scanning the gates with the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times. No one saw the slight wince that crossed his features when he adjusted his bag. No one recognized in this humble figure anything more than what appeared on the surface. Flight 447 to Seattle was boarding at gate B27, and James Morgan made his way there with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing only made the pain worse. Seat 2A was located in the second row of first class, a position that offered both privacy and proximity to the galley where the flight attendants prepared their service. The cabin itself was a study in carefully designed luxury, with seats upholstered in cream-colored leather that still held that new car smell, each one wide enough to be a small throne and equipped with its own personal entertainment screen, power outlets, and a footrest that extended into a fully flat bed. Soft overhead lighting cast a warm glow over polished wood-grain accents and brushed metal fixtures, creating an atmosphere that whispered of exclusivity and comfort. James lowered himself into his assigned seat with the careful choreography of someone who had to think about every movement, his cane propped against the armrest, his small duffel tucked beneath the seat in front of him. The leather sighed beneath his weight, and for just a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and appreciate the simple comfort of a seat that did not press against his damaged leg. Around him, the other first-class passengers were settling into their own small kingdoms of personal space. Across the aisle in seat 2C, a woman in an expensive silk blouse was already tapping away at her laptop, diamond earrings catching the light with every movement of her head. In row 1, a man in a tailored charcoal suit was speaking loudly into his phone about quarterly earnings and market projections, his voice carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. None of them looked at James directly, but he could feel the weight of their peripheral glances, the subtle double takes and lingering stares that he had learned to recognize over the years. Near the galley, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag that read Crystal was arranging champagne flutes on a silver tray. Her colleague, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, leaned in close, and James watched as Crystal's eyes flicked toward him, then away, then back again. The younger attendant whispered something, and Crystal's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded, her expression shifting from welcoming professionalism to something cooler, more assessing. She set down the champagne tray and straightened her navy blue uniform jacket, her gaze now fixed on James with a kind of scrutiny usually reserved for anomalies that needed to be identified and corrected. Crystal moved down the aisle with the practiced grace of someone who had walked these narrow corridors thousands of times. Her smile professionally pleasant, but her eyes remaining sharp and analytical. She stopped beside seat 2A, and James looked up from adjusting his seatbelt to meet her gaze. Her smile never wavered, but there was something in the tightness around her mouth that told him everything he needed to know about what was coming. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of politeness that somehow managed to convey doubt. "I just need to verify your boarding pass, if you don't mind." It was not really a request, and they both knew it. James reached into his jacket pocket without hurry, his movements deliberate and calm, and produced the boarding pass that he had printed at the kiosk downstairs. He handed it to her without a word. Watching as she took it between two perfectly manicured fingers and examined it as though it might be a forgery. Her eyes scanned every detail: the seat assignment, the passenger name, the confirmation number, and James could see the small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows. As she found nothing apparently wrong with it, she turned it over, looking at the blank back, then turned it over again. "Seat 2A," she said aloud, as if saying it might make some hidden error reveal itself. "That's correct," James replied quietly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who had breathed in too much desert sand and smoke. Crystal's lips pressed together again, and she glanced back toward the galley where her colleague was watching. "This is first class," she added, unnecessarily, and James simply nodded. "I'm aware," he said, and there was no challenge in his tone, no anger, just a statement of fact delivered with the patience of someone who had been through variations of this conversation before. Crystal held the boarding pass a moment longer, as if reluctant to return it, then handed it back with a smile that had grown noticeably cooler. "Just one moment, sir," she said, and turned on her heel, walking back to the galley with quick, purposeful steps. James watched as she leaned close to a tall man in the same navy uniform, his silver name tag catching the light as he bent his head to listen. And even from 2 rows away, James could see the way the man's expression shifted from mild interest to focused attention. Marcus was a man in his mid-40s with the rigid posture of someone who took pride in authority, his shoulders squared beneath his uniform jacket and his jaw set in a way that suggested he was not accustomed to having his judgment questioned. He approached seat 2A with Crystal slightly behind him, and James could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere as other passengers began to sense that something unusual was happening. The woman with the diamond earrings paused in her typing. The businessman in row 1 ended his phone call mid-sentence. Marcus stopped at James's row and looked down at him with eyes that were neither warm nor particularly hostile, just coldly professional and assessing. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet cabin. "I'm Marcus Chen, the head flight attendant on this flight. I understand there might be some confusion about your seating assignment." James met his gaze steadily, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. "No confusion," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm in seat 2A, as assigned." Marcus's expression did not change, but something in his stance suggested he had already made up his mind about the situation before approaching. "I see," he said slowly. "And you're certain this is your seat? Sometimes the kiosks can make errors, or perhaps there was a mix-up with an upgrade. I just want to make sure everything is correct before we take off." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and James felt the familiar weight of being judged settling over his shoulders. He had worn this weight many times before. In hospitals where nurses assumed he was homeless, in restaurants where hosts seated him near the kitchen, in countless small moments where his appearance had written a story about him that had nothing to do with who he actually was. "I'm certain," James said, and he reached again for his boarding pass, holding it up so Marcus could see it clearly. "This is my ticket. This is my seat. And I paid for it." Marcus took the boarding pass, examined it with the same suspicious scrutiny that Crystal had employed, and then looked back at James, his eyes moving pointedly from the faded jacket to the worn boots to the simple canvas bag. "Sir," he said, and his tone had shifted into something firmer, more authoritative. "First-class tickets are quite expensive, and I need to ensure that all our passengers are properly accommodated." Around them, the cabin had gone almost silent, and James could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes watching this small drama unfold. Marcus's professional veneer was beginning to crack, revealing something harder and less patient beneath. He handed the boarding pass back to James, but his expression had shifted from skeptical to openly doubtful. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify this with the gate agent," he said, his voice rising slightly in volume. "These tickets cost several $1,000s, and given the circumstances, I have reason to believe there may have been a system error, or perhaps some other irregularity." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and James felt his jaw tighten despite his determination to remain calm. "Are you suggesting I stole this ticket?" he asked quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, only a bone-deep weariness. "I'm suggesting," Marcus replied, his tone now carrying an edge sharp enough to cut, "that we need to resolve this situation before departure, and the easiest solution would be for you to move to your actual assigned seat while I sort out the confusion." He emphasized the word actual in a way that made his meaning unmistakably clear. From seat 1A, the businessman who had been on his phone earlier suddenly spoke up, his voice loud and irritated. "Excuse me," he said, turning in his seat to face Marcus directly, his expensive watch glinting as he gestured impatiently. "But how much longer is this going to take? Some of us have connections to make in Seattle, and I didn't pay for first class to sit through whatever this is." He waved his hand dismissively toward James, not even bothering to look at him directly, as if he were merely an inconvenient object rather than a person. Marcus turned to the businessman with an apologetic smile that he had not offered James. "I completely understand, Mr. Blackwell," he said, clearly recognizing the man from previous flights or perhaps from the premium status attached to his ticket. "We're handling this situation right now. I assure you we'll have it resolved within minutes." Richard Blackwell, a man in his early 60s with silver hair styled with expensive precision and a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, shook his head with visible annoyance. "This is exactly the kind of disruption that shouldn't happen in first class," he said loudly, addressing not just Marcus but seemingly the entire cabin. "We pay premium prices for premium service, not to deal with seating errors and people who clearly don't belong here." James took a slow breath, feeling the pain in his leg intensify as tension flooded his body. "I have every right to be in this seat," he said, his voice still calm but with a firmness that came from years of commanding men in situations far more dire than this. "I purchased this ticket with my own money, and I am not moving." Marcus's face flushed slightly, his authority being challenged in front of the passengers he was meant to manage. "Sir," he said, his voice now loud enough that everyone in first class and several rows into economy could hear clearly, "I am the head flight attendant on this aircraft, and I am telling you that you need to move to economy class immediately, or I will have no choice but to call security and have you removed from this flight entirely. We have other passengers who deserve to board without this kind of disruption." Around them, several passengers had pulled out their phones. The small rectangles held up to capture the confrontation on video. James could see the red recording lights blinking like small accusatory eyes, documenting his humiliation for an audience of strangers on the internet. Crystal stood behind Marcus with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of vindication and discomfort, and the diamond-earringed woman in 2C was whispering urgently to someone on her own phone. The scene felt surreal, like watching himself from outside his own body, and suddenly James was no longer in seat 2A of a luxury aircraft, but standing in the Atlanta airport 12 years ago, fresh off a medical transport from Germany, his leg in a brace and his duffel full of medications and discharge papers. He remembered the stairs then, too, The way people had looked at his uniform and his injury with expressions that ranged from pity to suspicion, the way a security agent had pulled him aside for additional screening because he fit some profile that had nothing to do with his service and everything to do with the way trauma had carved itself into his features. He remembered standing in that security line, trying to explain that the metal in his leg would set off the detector, trying to maintain his dignity while strangers watched and whispered and assumed things about him that were not true. The memory crashed over him like a wave, and he felt his hands begin to tremble slightly where they rested on the armrests. James closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, he had made his decision. Fighting this battle would accomplish nothing except creating a spectacle that would satisfy the phone-wielding audience around him. He had learned long ago that some fights were not worth the cost, and this was one of them. "Fine," he said quietly, and reached down to retrieve his duffel bag from beneath the seat in front of him. The movement required him to bend forward, putting pressure on his damaged leg, and he felt the familiar spike of pain shoot from his knee up through his hip. He gritted his teeth against it, refusing to let the discomfort show on his face any more than necessary. Getting the bag out required maneuvering in the confined space, and his cane clattered against the seat frame as he tried to manage both it and the duffel simultaneously. Marcus and Crystal stood in the aisle watching him with expressions that held no sympathy, no recognition of his struggle, just cold professional patience waiting for the problem to resolve itself and remove itself from their first-class cabin. James gripped the armrest and began the process of standing, which for him was never a simple matter of just rising to his feet. He had to shift his weight carefully, plant his good leg firmly, and use both the armrest and his cane to lever himself upward while his left leg protested every inch of the movement. His hands, weathered and scarred from years of hard use, trembled slightly as they gripped the aluminum cane. And he hated that weakness, hated that these people were seeing him struggle, hated the way his body betrayed him in moments when he most needed to appear strong. Finally upright, he swayed slightly, finding his balance, and slung the duffel over his shoulder. "From seat 1A. Richard Blackwell's voice carried clearly through the cabin. "Finally," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby. "Some people just don't understand that certain spaces aren't meant for them." James heard the words, "Let them wash over him," and refused to respond. He had heard worse from better men, and he would not give this stranger the satisfaction of a reaction. James moved slowly down the aisle, Marcus walking behind him like a prison guard escorting an inmate, ensuring he would not change his mind and try to reclaim his seat. Each step required concentration, the cane tapping against the floor in an uneven rhythm that spoke of pain managed but never truly conquered. They passed through the galley, through the small space that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. The seats became narrower, pressed closer together, the overhead bins more cluttered, and the faces that looked up at him held curiosity and confusion rather than disdain. In row 15, seat C, a young woman in navy blue scrubs looked up from the paperback novel in her lap, and James saw her eyes widen as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Sarah Chen was 28 years old, an emergency room nurse finishing a double shift who had chosen the early morning flight home to Seattle so she could sleep in her own bed after 3 exhausting days covering for sick colleagues. She watched as the older man with the cane limped past, his dignity intact despite the obvious humiliation of being escorted from first class. And something in her chest tightened with anger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of boarding passengers and rolling luggage. She unbuckled her seatbelt and half stood in her cramped space, addressing Marcus directly. "Why is he being moved? Did he do something wrong?" Marcus stopped, irritation flashing across his features at this new interruption. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern," he said curtly. "Please remain seated so we can complete boarding." But Sarah had spent too many nights in the emergency room, watching people be judged and dismissed because of how they looked, and had seen too many homeless veterans and struggling families treated as less than by staff who should have known better. "He has a ticket, doesn't he?" she pressed, her voice rising. "I saw him sitting up there. You can't just throw someone out of their seat because you don't like how they look. That's discrimination." "Ma'am," Marcus repeated, his voice hardening. I need you to sit down now, or you'll be joining him in having security called. This is my aircraft, and I will manage my passengers as I see fit." James turned slightly, catching Sarah's eye, and gave her a small nod of gratitude. A gesture that said more than words could have conveyed. Seat 32B was located in the very back of the aircraft, just 3 rows from the lavatories, where the fuselage began to narrow and the engine noise was loudest. It was a middle seat wedged between a large man in a stained T-shirt who had already claimed both armrests and a teenager with headphones blaring music loud enough to be heard 3 feet away. The seat itself was narrow, with thin padding that had been compressed by thousands of previous passengers into something only marginally softer than the metal frame beneath. James lowered himself into the cramped space with considerably more difficulty than he had experienced in first class. His legs immediately pressed against the seat in front of him, leaving no room to extend or adjust his damaged limb into any position that might ease the constant ache. His duffel had to be shoved under the seat, taking up what little foot space existed, and his cane had to be angled awkwardly across his lap because there was nowhere else to put it. The contrast between where he had been 15 minutes ago and where he sat now was so stark, it might have been laughable if it were not so painful. James closed his eyes and took slow, measured breaths, the kind he had learned in physical therapy when the pain became too intense to bear without some kind of coping mechanism. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The rhythm was supposed to calm the nervous system, supposed to tell the body that everything was fine even when it was not. But beneath the physical pain, beneath the throbbing in his knee and the burning in his hip, there was a deeper ache that no breathing exercise could touch. It was the pain of being seen as less than, of having his worth measured by the fraying of his jacket cuffs rather than the content of his character. He had felt this pain before, had felt it acutely in the months after returning from Afghanistan when he had been medically discharged and sent back into a world that did not quite know what to do with broken soldiers. He remembered the hospital in Kandahar where they had pieced his leg back together after the improvised explosive device had torn through his patrol vehicle. Remembered the faces of the 3 men who had not made it out. Remembered waking up to the reality that his military career was over at 41 years old. The flight had been airborne for just over an hour when the turbulence hit, the aircraft shuddering and dropping suddenly as it encountered a pocket of unstable air over the Rocky Mountains. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers asking everyone to remain seated. James had been staring out the small window beside the teenager, watching the clouds drift past, trying to transport his mind somewhere beyond the confines of seat 32B, when he heard the commotion from several rows ahead. A woman's voice, high and panicked, cut through the ambient noise of the engines. "Please, somebody help! My husband can't breathe! Something's wrong!" James straightened in his seat as much as the cramped space would allow, his military training immediately bringing his senses to sharp attention. Around him, other passengers were craning their necks, trying to see what was happening. And he watched as Sarah, the young nurse from row 15, unbuckled her seatbelt and rushed forward despite the turbulence and the illuminated seatbelt sign. "Is there a doctor on board?" A flight attendant's voice called out urgently, and James could hear the edge of panic in it. "We need medical assistance!" Sarah reached the passenger in row 23, and James could just barely see over the seats as she knelt in the aisle beside a middle-aged man whose face was flushed an alarming red, his hands clawing at his throat. "I'm a nurse," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the rising panic with professional authority. "Sir, can you hear me? What did you eat?" The man could not answer, his airway clearly compromised, and his wife was sobbing beside him. "He had the chicken," she gasped. "He's allergic to shellfish, but they said it was chicken." "They promised it was just chicken?" Sarah's hands were already checking his pulse, tilting his head back, and James saw her turn sharply to the flight attendant who had appeared with the aircraft's medical kit. "I need an EpiPen now," she commanded. The flight attendant, a young man who looked barely out of training, fumbled with the red medical kit, throwing it open and rifling through the contents with shaking hands. His face went pale as he looked up at Sarah. "There isn't one," he said, his voice breaking. "We don't have an EpiPen in the kit." A murmur of panic rippled through the cabin like a wave. Passengers rising from their seats despite the turbulence. Voices overlapping in confusion and fear. The man in row 23 was making horrible gasping sounds, his lips beginning to turn blue, and his wife's sobs had become wails of terror. Sarah looked around desperately, as if an EpiPen might materialize from thin air, and James knew he had perhaps seconds to act. "I have one," he said, his voice not loud but carrying clearly through the chaos. Heads turned toward the back of the plane, confusion evident on faces that could not quite place where the voice had come from. James was already struggling to reach his duffel bag wedged beneath the seat, his movements awkward in the confined space, his cane clattering to the floor. "I have an EpiPen," he repeated, louder now. And he saw Sarah's head snap around, her eyes finding him in the back row. The man beside him shifted, trying to give him room, and James finally managed to drag the canvas bag onto his lap, unzipping it with hands that moved with practiced efficiency, despite the aircraft's continued shuddering. He kept the EpiPen in a small red pouch in the outer pocket, always easily accessible because his own severe allergy to bee stings had nearly killed him twice. He pulled it free and held it up. "Here!" Sarah was already moving down the aisle, nearly stumbling as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, and James pressed the EpiPen into her outstretched hand. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw the gratitude and relief flooding her features. "Thank you," she breathed. And then she was gone, racing back to row 23. James watched as she expertly administered the injection, her movements confident and sure, pressing the auto-injector against the man's thigh through his pants and holding it there for the required 10 seconds. The cabin fell silent except for the engine noise and the man's labored breathing. Everyone waiting, watching. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, the man drew in a deep, shuddering breath. The blue tinge began to fade from his lips, and his wife collapsed against him, sobbing with relief instead of terror. Around the cabin, passengers began to applaud, a spontaneous expression of collective relief, and James felt dozens of eyes turning toward him. The captain's voice came through the overhead speakers a few minutes later, once the medical emergency had stabilized and the turbulence had eased. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. I want to take a moment to personally thank the passenger who provided the EpiPen that likely saved a fellow traveler's life today. Your quick thinking and generosity exemplify the best of humanity. And on behalf of everyone at Skyward Airlines, we are deeply grateful." The cabin erupted in another round of applause, and James felt his face flush with discomfort at being the center of attention. He nodded acknowledgement to the passengers around him who were now looking at him with expressions vastly different from those he had received in first class. The large man beside him clapped him on the shoulder with genuine warmth, and the teenager with the headphones had pulled them down and was looking at him with something like awe. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared at his row, and the teenager immediately offered to switch seats with her. She slid into seat 32A with a grateful smile, then turned to face James directly. "You saved his," she said simply. "He's stable now, breathing normally. The paramedics will meet us when we land, but he's going to be okay because of you." James shook his head slightly. "You're the one who knew what to do," he replied quietly. "I just happened to have what you needed." Sarah studied his face for a moment, really looking at him, seeing past the worn clothing and the lines of pain. "Why do you carry one?" she asked gently. James hesitated, then decided there was no harm in the truth. "Bee sting allergy," he said. "Nearly died from one in Afghanistan. And again, a few years after I got back. Been carrying one ever since." "Afghanistan," Sarah repeated softly. "You served?" 23 years, Army," James said. And there was no pride or bravado in his voice. Just a statement of fact. Made it through all of that. And it was a bee that almost got me. There was a moment of silence between them, comfortable and understanding. "His name is David," Sarah said finally. "The man you saved. He's a teacher from Boulder, married 32 years, 3 grandchildren. His wife told me he's terrified of flying, but does it anyway to visit them." Sarah glanced toward the front of the aircraft, then back at James, and he could see the question forming in her mind before she asked it. "Can I ask you something?" she said, keeping her voice low. "Why didn't you fight back harder when they were kicking you out of first class? You clearly had every right to be there, and what they did was wrong. You could have insisted, made a bigger scene, demanded they call someone to verify your ticket." James was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the worn grip of his cane. "I've learned something over the years," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Fighting doesn't always mean shouting or demanding or making yourself heard in the moment. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is observe. Watch how people behave when they think there are no consequences for their actions. That tells you everything you need to know about their character." Sarah frowned slightly, processing this. "But they humiliated you," she said. "In front of everyone." James nodded slowly. "They did," he agreed. "And now I know exactly who they are. That flight attendant, Marcus. He didn't see a passenger in seat 2A. He saw someone he thought was beneath him. Someone he believed didn't belong in a space he considered exclusive. He made assumptions based on my jacket and my boots and my cane, and then he acted on those assumptions with confidence and authority." Sarah leaned back in her seat, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. "You're right," she said softly. "If you had fought harder, screamed and caused a scene, they would have just painted you as the problem. They would have justified their actions by saying you were disruptive or aggressive. But by walking away with dignity, you let their actions speak for themselves." "Exactly," James said. "Actions speak louder than words. Always have. Always will. I judge people not by what they say or how they present themselves, but by how they treat others when they think there's no one watching. No one who can hold them accountable. That businessman in first class, Mr. Blackwell, he didn't just ignore me. He actively encouraged my removal because my presence made him uncomfortable. That tells me everything I need to know about him. And Marcus and Crystal, they chose to humiliate someone rather than verify a situation that confused them." The plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 8:47 in the morning, the tires chirping against the runway with a sound that always reminded James of finality, of journeys completed and destinations reached. The engines reversed thrust, slowing the aircraft, and around him passengers immediately began unbuckling seatbelts and reaching for overhead bins before the plane had even finished taxiing to the gate of that universal impatience to be anywhere but where they currently were. Sarah squeezed his hand briefly before standing. "Thank you again," she said warmly. "For everything?" James nodded, watching as she made her way forward to check once more on David, who was being kept near the front under observation until the paramedics could board. The deplaning process was slow, as it always was. Passengers crowding the aisle with their carry-on luggage and winter coats, shuffling forward inches at a time. James remained seated, knowing from experience that trying to stand and maneuver in this crush of humanity would only cause him pain and frustration. He waited, patient and still, until the crowd thinned. From his position in the back, he watched as Richard Blackwell emerged from first class, his expensive leather briefcase in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear with the other, already deep in conversation about something that sounded urgent and important. The businessman moved through economy class without a single glance to either side, his eyes fixed on the exit ahead, and when he passed row 32, he did not even register James's presence. No acknowledgement, no recognition of the man he had dismissed so casually 2 hours earlier. Not even awareness that they existed in the same space. He simply flowed past like water around a stone, and then he was gone. Finally, James stood, gathering his duffel and his cane, and began the slow journey forward. The cabin was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers collecting forgotten items from overhead bins and the flight crew beginning their post-flight procedures. At the exit door, Marcus and Crystal stood in their designated positions, offering professional smiles and scripted farewells to the departing passengers. Thank you for flying with us. Have a wonderful day in Seattle. We hope to see you again soon. Their voices were bright and pleasant, their postures perfect, their smiles never wavering. James stepped into the jet bridge. The subtle shift from recycled aircraft air to the slightly less recycled air of the airport terminal, and immediately saw her waiting at the gate entrance. Michelle Ramirez was 42 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that spoke of both professionalism and personal taste, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun that matched the efficient precision with which she managed every detail of his professional life. She had been his executive assistant for 7 years, long enough to read his moods and anticipate his needs, and the moment their eyes met, James saw concern flash across her normally composed features. "Mr. Morgan," she said, moving toward him with quick, purposeful steps, her heels clicking sharply against the terminal floor. She kept her voice low, professional, but he could hear the worry underneath. "Is everything all right?" "I was tracking the flight, saw the medical emergency alert." She glanced at his face, searching for signs of distress or injury, her brown eyes sharp with protective assessment. "I'm fine, Michelle," James assured her quietly, shifting his duffel to his other shoulder. "It wasn't me, just happened to have what was needed." She studied him for another moment, clearly not entirely convinced, then nodded and fell into step beside him as they began walking through the terminal. Her stride automatically adjusted to match his slower pace, a courtesy she had learned years ago without him ever having to ask. "We need to get you to the board meeting," she continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be a packed schedule. "They moved the start time to 9:30 to accommodate your arrival, but several members are already gathered in the executive conference room. David Winters wants to discuss the quarterly earnings before the full presentation, and Patricia Chen has concerns about the new route proposals." James nodded, his mind already beginning to shift gears from the humiliation of Flight 447 to the responsibilities waiting for him. "How are the numbers looking?" he asked. "Better than projected," Michelle replied with a small smile. "The new customer service initiatives you implemented last quarter are showing real results. Passenger satisfaction is up 18% across all routes." They walked through the terminal together, and James was acutely aware of how different this journey was from the one he had taken in Denver just hours earlier. Michelle gestured toward the main concourse. "I have a car waiting at the executive pickup area, Mr. Morgan, sir," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the busy terminal. "But if you'd prefer, we can take a few extra minutes and go through the office entrance. I know you wanted to see the new gate signage they installed in Concourse C." As they walked, James noticed the posters lining the walls. Large, glossy advertisements featuring aircraft soaring through blue skies, all bearing the distinctive logo he had designed himself 15 years ago when he had first founded the airline. "Skyward Airlines," the text read in bold letters, "where every journey matters." The slogan had been his idea too, born from his belief that air travel should not be a luxury reserved only for the wealthy, but a service that treated every passenger with equal dignity and respect. Near Gate B32, a gate agent in a Skyward Airlines uniform looked up from her computer, and her face lit with recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she called out warmly. "Welcome back, sir." "We're so glad to have you home." James smiled and raised his hand in acknowledgement. "Good morning, Rebecca. How's your daughter doing? Starting college this fall, right?" The woman's smile widened, clearly touched that he remembered. "She is, sir. Thank you for asking. She got into the nursing program she wanted." "That's wonderful news," James said genuinely, and Michelle made a note on her phone, likely a reminder to send a congratulatory gift or scholarship information. They continued walking, passing through sections of the terminal where Skyward Airlines dominated the gate assignments. And James saw more employees, ground crew members and flight attendants and customer service representatives, all of whom recognized him. A maintenance supervisor in coveralls nodded respectfully. A young flight attendant, probably new to the company, looked twice and then whispered excitedly to her colleague, "Mr. Morgan, Michelle said, glancing at her watch. We really should move a bit faster if you want to review the presentation materials before the board arrives. The executive offices of Skyward Airlines occupied the top floor of a building adjacent to the main terminal, connected by a private walkway that allowed senior staff to move between the corporate headquarters and the operational heart of the airline without navigating public spaces. James's office was spacious but not ostentatious, decorated with photographs from his military service and framed letters from passengers whose lives had been touched by the airline in meaningful ways. Michelle ushered him into the smaller private conference room next door, where Thomas Wright, the vice president of operations, was already waiting with his laptop open and several file folders spread across the polished table. Tom was 56, a former commercial pilot who had transitioned to management and brought with him a deep understanding of both the technical and human elements of running an airline. James, Tom said, standing to shake his hand. Good flight? James lowered himself into a chair with a slight grimace, setting his cane against the table edge. Eventful, he replied. Tom, I need you to pull the passenger manifest and full crew list for Flight 447 from Denver this morning. Tom's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded and began typing on his laptop. Sure thing, he said. Can I ask what this is about? Just need to review something, James said evenly. Also pull any incident reports filed for that flight. Tom worked in silence for a moment, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, then frowned at his screen. That's strange, he said. Flight 447 had a medical emergency mid-flight, anaphylactic shock, resolved successfully with passenger assistance. But there are no other incident reports filed. Nothing at all. James felt something cold settle in his chest. Nothing about a seating dispute? A passenger being relocated from first class to economy? Tom shook his head, scrolling through the system. Not a word, he confirmed. If something like that happened and wasn't reported, that's a serious protocol violation. James reached for Tom's laptop and turned it toward himself. Pull up social media, he said quietly. Search for Skyward Airlines and Flight 447. Tom made the calls himself, his voice professional but firm as he contacted the crew scheduling office and requested that Marcus Chen and Crystal Hayes report immediately to the executive conference room on the top floor. He did not provide a reason, just stated that their presence was required for an urgent operational matter. James sat at the head of the long conference table, having changed into a crisp white dress shirt and navy blazer that Michelle had retrieved from his office closet. His cane rested against his chair, visible but no longer the defining feature of his appearance. Tom sat to his right, and Michelle to his left, both with tablets open and expressions of quiet support. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the conference room door. And Michelle stood to answer it. Marcus and Crystal entered with the casual confidence of employees who had been summoned for what they assumed was routine business. Perhaps a commendation for handling the medical emergency or a procedural review. Marcus carried himself with his usual authoritative bearing, shoulders back, while Crystal's expression was professionally pleasant, perhaps even slightly curious. They walked 3 steps into the room before they saw him. James watched as recognition moved across their faces in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the dawning horror of understanding. Marcus stopped so abruptly that Crystal nearly walked into his back. The color drained from both their faces as if someone had opened a valve and let it all pour out, leaving them pale and frozen. Crystal's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus's eyes went wide, his jaw going slack, and James could see his throat working as he tried to swallow. Mr. Morgan, Marcus finally managed, his voice coming out strangled and weak, barely recognizable as the same authoritative tone he had used on the aircraft. Sir, we didn't. Please, have a seat, James said quietly, gesturing to the chairs across from him. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the moment more terrible. Crystal looked like she might be sick, her face now flushed red, where moments ago it had been white. Her hands trembled visibly as she pulled out a chair and lowered herself into it. Her movements mechanical. Shocked, Marcus sat beside her, his professional composure completely shattered, replaced by naked fear. James let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching as Marcus and Crystal sat rigid in their chairs, their eyes fixed on the table in front of them as if they could not bear to meet his gaze. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that filled the room. "I'm not going to yell at you," he said. "I'm not going to berate you or humiliate you the way you humiliated me this morning on Flight 447. That's not who I am, and more importantly, that's not who Skyward Airlines is supposed to be." Crystal's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus looked as though he might physically collapse. James continued, his words measured and deliberate. "What happened this morning was not simply a mistake or an error in judgment. It was a revelation of something deeper. Something I have been working to eliminate from this airline since the day I founded it. You didn't just ask to see my boarding pass or question whether there had been a system error. You looked at me, at my worn jacket and my cane and my modest appearance, and you decided I did not belong. You made a judgment about my worth based entirely on how I looked, and then you acted on that judgment with confidence and authority." He paused, letting his words settle. "Every passenger who boards one of our aircraft, whether they paid $50 for a basic economy seat or $5,000 for first class, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Every single one. That elderly woman traveling to see her grandchildren, that businessman rushing to close a deal, that college student flying home for the holidays, and yes, that disabled veteran in a faded jacket. They all deserve the same fundamental human courtesy." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and broken. "Mr. Morgan, sir, I am so deeply sorry. I have no excuse for my behavior. I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate and wrong." James nodded slowly. "You did," he agreed. "And here's what troubles me most. I founded this airline 23 years ago, right after I was medically discharged from the Army. I had served for over 2 decades, commanded men in 2 wars, been awarded medals for valor, and then I came home with a shattered leg and a discharge letter." James leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. "I could terminate your employment today, and I would be completely justified in doing so. But that would not solve the deeper problem. Instead, you will both be enrolled in mandatory retraining on unconscious bias, dignity in service, and our company values. You will be demoted from your current positions and placed on 6 months probation. You will work economy class exclusively during that time, and you will learn what it means to serve every passenger with equal respect." Crystal nodded through her tears, and Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you, sir. We will do better. We will be better." Over the following weeks, James implemented sweeping changes across Skyward Airlines. Every employee, from ground crew to executives, underwent comprehensive training on unconscious bias and the dignity owed to every human being. He shared his own story in a company-wide video, standing in his worn military jacket, speaking about how appearances deceive and character reveals itself through actions. Sarah Chen received a call 3 days after the flight, offering her a position as a consultant for the airline's medical emergency protocols and training programs. She accepted, honored to be part of building something better. 2 months later, James boarded Flight 892 to Denver, this time choosing seat 34C in economy. He talked with the young mother struggling with her toddler in the row behind him, offering patient smiles and understanding. He chatted with the nervous first-time flyer beside him, sharing stories that eased her anxiety. He thanked every flight attendant by name and treated each interaction as an opportunity to reinforce the culture he was building. As the plane lifted into the sky, James looked out at the clouds and reflected that sometimes the most painful experiences reveal exactly what needs to change. He had been humiliated, yes, but that humiliation had become a catalyst for transformation. In the end, people reveal who they truly are not by the clothes they wear or the money they carry, but by how they treat others when they believe no one is watching. Character cannot be bought or worn or displayed. It can only be lived, one choice at a time, one interaction at a time, one moment of dignity extended or withheld. That was the lesson James Morgan carried with him, and the legacy he was determined to leave behind.